A24 has another big movie that's now out, another movie that's gaining a lot of traction from critics and fans of the studio. And that one is called The Zone of Interest. And that's the final movie that we'll be talking about today. Okay, so what was your experience like watching this movie? Because this is a
Yeah,
very special movie.
yeah. So I had heard, whether it was from people like yourself that attended the festivals that saw it earlier this year. I had heard a lot of buzz about it. I am very intrigued by the director Jonathan Glazer, based off of Under the Skin of the film that he made. Was that 10 years ago? I think
Mhm,
now.
mhm.
I'm
Yeah,
not gonna.
he's made like
Yeah,
four movies over 23 years, which is
yeah.
interesting.
Very selective director, which I can appreciate. But when it comes to zone of interest, I had knew very, and this is something I always do with A24, is avoid trailers, and I'll see a poster or maybe a tagline or something, but I really like to go into these unknown films as cold as possible. So, but I knew that the premise was basically following a Nazi family that live literally right next door to them is a concentration camp. So I knew that element of it. And walking or not walking, I had the screener for after watching the film. I'm just like it's an interesting experimental film that definitely speaks on what the different forms that evil can come in that comes at this family living their everyday life with torturous horrific inhumane things going on right across their yard, and they're just like, oh, what are we gonna eat today? Oh, let's play in the yard. It's just like it's haunting to see all those images, and the
Yeah.
restraint that Jonathan Glazer displays in this film is even more impressive. That stereotypically in a Holocaust type of film, we would have saw what went on across this yard, but we just hear the
Mhm.
screams and the ashes of what's going on, the devastating things and the torturous things that these Nazis were doing to the Jewish people. It's just really impressive in that sense. And there's a scene in this film that perfectly demonstrates this experience, which is we open the film, mild spoilers. The first 3-4 minutes is just a pure black screen, and that is
And
more, and that
music,
to
yeah.
me let me into the side of like it's not what you see, it's more or less what you hear and how you interpret these moments of quiet intimate scenes of this again Nazi family that we're following for 90 minutes. So it's an experience that I can appreciate, but I wasn't overall satisfied with just like, there's
Interesting.
no plot really. We're just watching people do
Yeah.
everyday things. And the fact that we have to follow Nazis doesn't make it even, doesn't make it as, enticing or engaging or intangible, because these are terrible, horrible human beings that we're following doing just stuff that are just, everyday life stuff. So there's that experience to me was again can appreciate the art, and there's literally a scene of like a museum that to me perfectly encapsulates this experience. It was like you can go to a museum and
Mhm.
appreciate the art, but without context or depth or having some type of thing that you can really relate to in a sense, made it a little bit different of a it was a very cold movie for me.
Okay. I'm definitely on the opposite spectrum. Like I definitely really loved this movie.
Hmm.
Um, it's absolutely I cannot compare this to any movie I've seen. It's a different watching experience too than pretty much any other movie. So the fact that there's no three-act story and the fact that you can't really relate to, I guess, anyone and what they're doing
Yeah.
is
I mean, you can.
may turn
They're
off a
doing
lot of
everyday
people.
stuff. They're doing like stuff we do. Eat, sleep, talk about work and life. But it's just like, yeah, from a Nazi.
Yeah. And but I do think that in terms of Jonathan Glazer's vision for this movie and how it came together as like I guess a sensory experience, as you said, like the moment that like there's a black screen and then it sucks you into a time capsule. I thought it was just incredibly made, and it definitely like shocks you in that way um, of the restraint. I think that's a key. That's a key word here with his approach because again, they're kind of there's awful things going on in the background. I listened to an interview where the sound editing was literally like they did movie one and movie two, and they don't interact pretty much. So what you don't see is really what you play in here because any other movie you actually see the violence. Here you never actually see into the camps. You never actually see into um, like what's happening to the Jewish characters. You might see smoke, you might hear guns, but the characters are just continuing with their life, which I think is incredibly haunting. And there's also some incredible symbolism, whether it's like stories that they read or pieces of music that they find, or even like the way certain items are framed that I thought like beautifully framed um, the horrors that you don't see again. And so I guess you have to go in, like obviously knowing basic history
Mhm.
of like 1940s Europe, but I do think like the actors were they played it really well, and the cinematography. I guess that might have been what turned you and I'm sure some others off is that you can't get close to these characters, which I think is a deliberate decision made by Jonathan Glazer because he and the cinematographer spoke after the screening that I was at about how they didn't want to romanticize these characters by putting them too up close. Being Jewish, being connected to that part of history through my ancestors and
Mhm.
hearing stories all my life, and then actually having visited the real Auschwitz, which, like you said, you get glimpses of towards the end. I was so moved, I guess, by the portrayal. I felt like it was such a powerful way to capture a time capsule and sort of what was going on this side of the world when an entire nation just wanted to know nothing or normalize this like ordinary way of life due to bigotry and nationalism that we were
Mhm.
seeing in Europe at the time. So that's why I thought it was such a moving film, even though I'm sure the pacing could have turned a lot of people off.
Yeah, no, and listen, I respect that perspective because it is,
Mm-hmm.
seeing that, um, the story play out, or not necessarily the story, but yeah, seeing the restraint and just knowing the history that comes with there in that time period, and knowing that we don't have to see it, we know the history, and it is something that we've
Yeah.
seen on screen that is just, it's not something you want to, you don't just turn on a Holocaust movie on a Tuesday afternoon. Like, you have to be in that mindset and prepare yourself for the tragedies that came with that just horrific time period. That, like you said, there was a lot of ignorance and the absent nature of like just being a human being and caring is very interesting perspective to take on a narrative. So yeah, again, I can appreciate again very much so as this movie just shows a scene in the museum and how it's preserving this time period that was just so tragic and so horrific, and just watching it from afar. And that's the experience that I had from it. I was watching it from afar and not being as engaged with these characters because again, you're just watching them do their thing, and that's the side of it of like a movie going experience. That's the traditional sense of like, again, you have to re-trigger your
Yeah.
mind of like what you're going into, because again, there is no, all right, I gotta watch this even though he's a Nazi, like, let's see if he even has an ounce of caring, or is he gonna come across a Jewish person that he wants to maybe help out. But there's none of that. That's not the story at all. It's just, again, we're just watching these
Mm-hmm.
characters just do their day-to-day life while all these horrific things are going on in their backyard. So again, I
Mm-hmm.
can appreciate the art. I just wasn't as attached to anything other than just witnessing what we're seeing on screen. So like, again, it was just very much a watch from afar. It reminded me, I don't know if you saw earlier this year, Skinamarink, the horror film that's very
I
much
did not
so,
watch that.
I don't recommend it. But it's experience very much so like the zone. I much more preferred the Zone of Interest than I did Skinamarink. But that is another film that was
Okay,
very
because I
like,
heard that one wasn't very good from what I
yeah,
heard.
there's like no,
So it's like
there's
interesting.
no characters' names. There's no, you don't see anyone's physical, like, it's very much so like just experience this, right? So again, I can always appreciate
Yeah. So
experimental filmmaking, but this one, again, it didn't really stick the landing for me with the Zone of Interest. But again, I can appreciate your perspective on it.
interesting that you say that about the characters' names, which is like this is apparently inspired by a book. Like the book was the groundwork for this movie,
Okay.
but in that book, all the commanders and etc. were fictional
Mm,
characters, and here it was important for him to make it after real people to sort of make it as believable as possible.
mm,
But I do think the things that enhanced it to me is compared to your experience, or the personal perspective that I bring from it,
yeah.
um, especially having been there this last year and seeing those shots of like the modern we say museum but it's like it's a very interesting way to like memorial museum, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
um, really impacted me. And then also, I think I had also just known that this was going to be the approach of the movie, not necessarily the no story structure element, but
yeah,
the
yeah,
fact that like you weren't going to see anything, that this was kind of just from the perspective of evil. But I think I just appreciated how much it was so different from anything that we've seen
yeah.
ever. I think from a movie like this. And I think the one other thing that really enhanced it for me
Hmm.
was watching it in a theater, um,
Yeah, I bet. Yeah,
because then you kind of you can't look away, like you're
right.
not going to take out your phone or
Yeah,
anything. But I think I was
yeah.
also, because I had built up my expectations for this one because I had heard so many things. I was really engaged, engaged in the way that I was looking at all the details and all the symbolism and the impact
Mm,
that Jonathan Glazer was putting into there. And you could tell that everyone was sort of glued to the screen, and you could hear a pin drop. So, you
mm.
know, my audience seemed to really love it, and it seemed to have really been like just blown away by how
Yeah.
haunting and specific and meticulous it was.
Hmm.
Absolutely, that's why I'd recommend you see it in the theater. I don't know if it hits the same way without, because you definitely have to
Yeah.
sort of pay attention and be in this quiet space where you're not really paying attention to the fact that you're not in it with them, because you're sort of a fly on the wall for an hour and
Yeah,
45 minutes.
that's a great way. Yeah, and like I said, I was, I'm looking. The screener's right over there, so I saw it at home. So to your point, yeah, there is
Yeah.
those, normal distractions of phone. Oh, let me get something to eat. Let me go to the bathroom. So I can definitely, and I'm always someone that prides myself on if I see a film in the theater or on an airplane. The story is a story, right? You can be engaged regardless of where you see it, but it does kind of help when you experience something for the first time and you're not forced, but when you're in a theater, it's just like you don't have those distractions. So my experience was definitely different, especially when you're in an audience with the director and all that stuff. So yeah, maybe if I would have saw it in theater, it might have had a little bit of a different impact. But again, the story is still the story, and the performances are still the same. So,
Hmm.
but again, I appreciate the artistic approach from this because it is very unique in its own sense. And going back to A24, that's what I love about the studio. Whether it's a everywhere, everything, everywhere, all at
Hmm.
once, or Iron Claw, or Zone of Interest, or Ex Machina. They always expect the unexpected with the studio, and that's why I will always be a
Yeah.
fan of A24.
Yeah, even with those movies, there was more of a story structure. So I totally understand this being possibly one of their more inaccessible movies, but it seems to also be getting a lot of awards love due to the subject matter
Yeah,
and how differently it was conveyed. Which I'm on board with it, but I totally understand that just
hmm,
the pacing um, must have brought it down for a lot of people who weren't expecting it. But
for sure.
again, differing takes. That's part of what's beautiful about film discourse.
100%, 100%, man.
So yeah, that was our talk for some new releases that you can now watch in theaters, and Rebel Moon on Netflix as well. So tell us where everyone can find you on social media before we sign off.
Yeah, man. Well, again, thank you so much for having me on. I'm so glad we are able to get this, perfect timing, date, and all that stuff. Happy holidays to everyone out there and yourself. But yeah, you guys can find me on the interwebs, whether it's on YouTube, talking about some of these movies all the movies we discussed today, TV shows, and what have you. Try to stay active on all the other social media accounts, Letterbox. Um, Instagram, Twitter, or X, I should say, and all those different platforms. So yeah, if you're intrigued to know my thoughts on certain movies or movie topics or what have you, definitely check me out on all those social media outlets. And again, man, thank you for having me on. It's a fun discussion that we had
Of
today.
course, I would not have remembered to say X instead of Twitter.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I'm still Twitter here.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so yeah, thank you again, and thank you everyone for watching. I'm Gaul. This has been Feature Fanatics, and have a great holidays to everyone watching.